Joining me now is a member of the Ways and Means Committee that has made this decision to release these tax returns once they are reviewed and redacted. Jimmy Gomez is a Democrat of California who's extensively reviewed Donald Trump's tax records since they were released to the committee late last month. Congressman Gomez, you have had some time. This isn't brand new. You've had a chance to look at this. If you could, for our viewers, lay out why it was important for Congress to get Donald Trump's tax returns in the first place, and for your decision to release these tax returns to the public.
Thank you. Great question. So I want to be very clear that the committee was looking at Donald Trump's taxes, or asked to look at them, but in the context of reviewing the mandatory audit program of all that reviews all taxes of every single president and vice president since 1977. But since then, every single presidential candidate and vice president released their taxes on their own, except Donald Trump. So we wanted to know how the program was working, and was it really doing the audits it was supposed to? And one of the things that showed it was not. That the mandatory audit program did not complete one audit of President Donald Trump's tax returns. Not one single audit was complete. And they did not start an audit program until after Rich Neal sent a letter in April 3rd of 2019. So this is something that the American people should care about. The American people want to know if the President of the United States is making decisions based on their interest or the president's own financial self-interest. And that's what it comes down to, is why are you making these decisions? The audit program is supposed to help people ensure that they're making decisions based on the American people's self-interest. So this is something that we've been working on. I think that the report's going to show that the IRS audit program did not work, and that the fact that Donald Trump's taxes are also so complicated that the resources that they have is not sufficient.
Let me ask you about this, Congressman. Is this then this disclosure of Donald Trump's tax returns, is this about the IRS and its audit program, or is this about Donald Trump?
It's about both. And the reason why it's about both is that when a presidential candidate doesn't voluntarily release their tax returns, there's also a backup mechanism, there's a automatic audit program of the president's tax returns. So that should give people faith that these audits are occurring. And one of the things we wanted to know as Democrats, did that happen? And this report will show that did not happen once during Donald Trump's 4 years in office. And that's what it's not just about Donald Trump. It's about the presidency in itself, that we are a system of checks and balances. The president is a unique figure in American government, and that they have powers that they can direct departments, that they can veto legislation. And what we want to know is basically if there's a conflict of interest amongst the president or the vice president. And that's what it's about. Donald Trump is just the current or was the former occupant of the office, and that's why we're seeking his tax returns.
Do you at this point have reason to believe, based on the information you have and the information that will become public to us very shortly, that there was some wrongdoing that will be disclosed by the release of Donald Trump's tax returns? Not wrongdoing on the part of the audit program of the IRS, but in fact in terms of Donald Trump and what he said to be the case in his tax returns.
Yeah, one of the things that I think people are going to realize that he just lied the entire time when it came to being under audit for years. I think you're going to be able to see that. But it's also going to raise some red flags on when it comes to did Donald Trump file tax returns that were complete, that were truthful? We can't necessarily answer all those questions, but there was a lot of red flags when it comes to deductions, when it comes to providing substantiating evidence. A lot of his returns didn't show that. And also it's going to paint, I think, a more complete picture of how Donald Trump has structured his financial dealings. It's not going to be complete. It's not necessarily going to be one smoking gun, but I think people are going to be shocked about how little documentation that this former president offered up to substantiate a lot of his deductions and and his underwriting what he claims is his personal fortune. So I think people will be shocked when they see the returns.
Are we going to be able to understand this? Tax returns are notoriously difficult to understand. Is there some methodology that you and your committee are using to bring this forward that makes it clear to the average viewer, reader, listener what Donald Trump did that was incorrect?
Yeah, the report, I just want to be clear that the Joint Committee on Taxation doesn't point out that he violated the law. What it says that there's a lot of red flags that an audit program, if it would have been would have been conducted, it would have raised a lot of red flags to go deeper. They never went deeper because they never started an audit in the first place, right? They never completed it. So it's going to show that he has a complicated tax scheme. He has multiple entities, that he is the controlling agent in a lot of them. He has 400 pass-through entities. That's really difficult to kind of unravel. So I think it's going to take some time for the American people to see what he actually did. But I think that this is a step forward. And I think it also will give the American people some confidence that we're going to pass legislation in order to strengthen the mandatory audit program of presidents and vice presidents of the United States.
Congressman Gomez, Kevin Brady, also on your committee, Republican of Texas, says all this does is opens it up for committees to, in a politicized way, examine the tax returns of every American. It just politicizes the process. What's your response to that?
That's completely incorrect. The law, or the IRS, already kind of determines that the president holds a unique position. If it didn't, why have a mandatory audit program? It's because they know that the president is embodied with all the powers of the executive branch, and that releasing this report as well as the tax returns to show that the audit was never done and there should have been an audit. I think it's going to give people faith that whoever holds the office, Democrat or Republican, is not above the law and is there paying their fair share of taxes. So if Republican who are going to be in the majority soon enough, if they want to use the power of 6103 to go after business leaders, as they said, or labor leaders, they're the ones that are expanding the precedent of this action that we took today. Not Democrats, the Republicans are. But we believe that the president is a unique individual in the American government that must be checked. And that's what we're trying to do with revealing the findings of these reports as well as the tax returns.